Welcome to another episode of Test, Optimize, and Scale. It is a distinct pleasure to have Brian Swichkow here with us today, managing partner, Wanting Cooperative. I know him as one of the best growth hackers, expert when it comes to platforms such as Reddit, all different types of social avenues. We're going to get to that later, automations. Hopefully we'll be able to explain why there's so many Post-its on your wall behind you as well, too. Brian, pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I've known you for a few years. We've had some in-depth chats and run into each other at events before, after COVID, but want to familiarize the audience a bit with your story. Yeah. If you could elaborate on your path for listeners.
Yeah, I mean, in my childhood, I loved building stuff. And shortly after college, before I knew what I was doing, I kind of inadvertently created a marketing and creative agency. And probably prior to actually realizing that that was an agency, started to experience friction with clients where they would hire me because I was, quote, a brilliant or an expert or a genius at social media marketing, which is kind of how I was labeling it back then. And then they would tell me what to do. And I was like, but you hired me for this expertise and now you're telling me what to do. That doesn't make sense. And I want to make stuff. And you hired me to make stuff and now you're preventing me from making stuff. So I had this idea back in 2012 that I wanted a team of people to be able to create things that seemed of value, things that seemed fun. But I didn't want to be dictated by clients or investors. And basically spent about 10 years kind of piecing all the aspects of that together. And in 2014, just kind of because I was perpetually creating with the space that I had, I saw an opportunity to write an article about something that I'd done a few months prior, just as an experiment, which was that I targeted my roommate with, I advertised to my roommate with very targeted Facebook ads. And I had told the story 100 times, just kind of got tired of telling it. So I was like, I'll write it and I'll figure out how to write it. And then I want to get traffic to it. So I've heard of this Reddit thing. So I spent about a month learning how to write and learning how to talk to Reddit. And then after a month, I actually wrote the article and submitted it to Reddit, hit the front page, got cross-posted to best of, hit the front page again. I got cited in like every marketing magazine that I'd ever read. And that just kind of became a new chapter in my career and public persona. It also really reinforced this notion that, creating things that your gut feels that should exist, or like, oh, that'd be so cool, but like, if only I could find the time, that stuff is the stuff that really leaps forward. So people started pitting me as a Reddit marketing expert. I kind of leaned into that. And in the probably 7 or 8 years following, have consulted with startups between seed and Series B, most often just after they've raised or when they're trying to raise, to help get them growth metrics to help to facilitate that. So learned a lot about fundraising, learned a lot about revenue generation, and for our organization have really focused on the latter, so that we have more space to just kind of experiment and chase leads on new opportunities. So everything that we do today is split between 3 different kind of buckets. We have our agency, our community, and our studio. And agency services for hire, community, events, affiliate partnerships, and then studio is we make predominantly communication software, but sometimes just creative projects for the hell of it.
So you create an agency accidentally, realize it's not really what you thought it was and what you're looking to do. Meanwhile, you're working on content. You actually sit down. I say actually because you talked about the process before that. Write an article about how you're retargeting your roommate with ads, which I love, by the way. I've heard of this done for birthdays and other things like that within the ad tech community, which is my background before the agency, so definitely resonates with me. And that ends up captivating people, so much so that when you're submitting it, all of these publishers that you frequent are covering it, heard front page in there. So you said, all right, there's something here. I could do this professionally. whether it's around fundraising or revenue growth, more of a focus on revenue growth, especially for your organization, where you have agency, community, and studio in place. Agency, we talk about that enough on the show. Work for hire, as you mentioned, community events, and I happen to know the engagement levels, volume of this audience, and then studio, where beyond software development, you're working on all types of cool things that excite you, things that keep you working late night, early morning. Hard to feel that blend and where the line ends from work and play.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really just a perpetual drive towards a canvas for creation. And the studio is kind of all right, if someone gives us a big bucket of money and says, go do you, great. Like that's the dream. And the fact that probably won't happen, we're making the big bucket of money. But it's not just this kind of like selfish desire to make what I want, but rather, make with people. And that's where the community comes in. So every time we're making something, it started as like a verbal joke, with like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if, and then, when we kind of figure out like, okay, like now we can tell this joke and pretty much like 90% conversion rate of like, from listening to this to a laugh. Better yet, if we can tell it, in a sentence in a bar where it's really loud. And so just, really prototyping it verbally, and then prototyping it, in words through an email or a landing page or something like that. Prototyping it beyond our community to someone who's never met us before. If we can make someone who's never met us before be like, then we're now validating like, all right, cool, let's put in some cash to actually do this. And it could be, a software platform. It could be a satire website. It could be any number of things. But, a lot of times, and especially with pranking my roommate, it really just raised the question of like, who the fuck had the time to do this? And people chasing down that curiosity to this day, I get emails from people being like, hey, I just read your article about pranking your roommate. I want to hire you. That was published in 2014. So like, I constantly joke about like trying to measure the ROI on that article. And I don't think I could. I'd have to attribute every piece of income that has come in, since 2014 to that article.
Ultimate SEO value and ROI at this point in that return. And when you say software, that can mean so many things. What type of software are you getting approached for with your agency hat on? What type of software is being talked about in the community? What type of software are you guys innovating in the studio?
Yeah. We most often attract software companies and social platforms who have something that is beautiful, but also kind of like more ineffable, right? So something that is very multidimensional, complex, like, things that are difficult to communicate. And a lot of times it's with technical co-founders who are trying to communicate something technically. And so, we had a virtual meeting platform that we incubated. They came to us because they're like, we have this thing, you seem super passionate about it, and we want you to promote it. And it's beautiful. They have like, it's WebRTC, like all of the people who come into this kind of like metaverse environment, their devices talk to each other rather than use a central server. So it's super efficient. And on the face of it, like everybody who we saw experience it was talking about like, it feels like I'm connecting with people. It doesn't feel so stale. Like they were using all this emotional language and they couldn't figure out how to explain why. And what was happening was that people would come in and have these really beautiful experiences, but then not be able to communicate them elsewhere. And what was comical, and it was that we kept equating it to like doing drugs. People would come in and be like, like it was like doing psychedelics and then trying to explain to someone what that was like. And so, we love just kind of those types of communicational challenges and figuring out how to convey that to someone who hasn't yet had that experience. So yeah, a lot of what we do is with stuff that just kind of doesn't fit any one particular box. That tends to be what we attract.
Sure. And you're well known in some of these communities. I know we talked about some of the social platforms specifically. Can you explain the type of topics that you're discussing on these online forums? I know you told me how you've been branded with the Post-its behind you. And for audio listeners, it's literally covering the whole wall behind Brian here. I was actually on your podcast a few years ago, and I've only seen, and I was there in person, I've only seen it grow since. What are some of the things you're known for in these communities, and how does that lead to the discussions that get you guys in the builder's seat for these softwares?
Yeah. As mentioned, when I posted my article about pranking my roommate with Facebook ads, I thought people would contact me because they wanted me to do Facebook ads for them. But because it went viral due to Reddit, and largely because I had a very pragmatic and analytical answer as to how did you make that happen. Because for me, I mean, when that went viral because of Reddit, I had only been on Reddit for about 30 days prior, but I had very intentionally spent 30 days learning Reddit. And so when people started asking me, how did you do that? I'm like, oh, well, okay, I read through these things and I looked for the commonalities in the language, and then I looked for a subreddit that fit these criteria, and then I sorted it by this. And then I found, the type of language, and then I, kind of created an avatar for the type of person that I was talking to, and that's who I wrote the article for. And so, logically that made sense to the people that I was communicating this to, and they, oh, okay, you understand how to do this. And, for me, like when I was a kid, I was a very socially awkward kid. And so I kind of my sister and my parents were very social. From my experience, they had lots of friends. They were very popular. And I wasn't, and I just didn't understand why. So from a social standpoint, I kind of learned how to interact socially in a very logical way. And so I've always, to some degree, just kind of maintained this ability to communicate to people who don't get it, how to understand it, at least logically, and then kind of how to work their way into it. So most of what I'm known for is really, I mean, I say empathy at scale, and over the years that's never caught on. But Reddit is one of those things where large companies will come to us, like Fortune 100s, and they'll say, like, we want to hire you to do Reddit marketing. What is Reddit? I'm like, okay. So imagine going to, imagine that friend that that's like super into that thing that you just don't understand. That's Reddit. Right. And so there's someone there that's obsessed with everything, and it's these very niche communities. And so you have to understand how to speak to that niche. And a lot of brands will stumble into it and kind of use the Facebook approach, which is this like broad scale, like, this is the best thing for this, buy now. And it's, posturing, soapboxing, whatever it may be. But it's not speaking to the community as a member of the community. So it's really this process of empathizing with a group of people, whether you call them a community or not, and then figuring out how to speak to them as though you understand who they are, without saying, I understand who you are. It's like showing up for a date and being like, I see that you too also like cats. It feels very stale. So really just teaching brands how to show up as themselves rather than to kind of bust into a room and start yelling.
I love how you went into your background there. First guest to the show, Ryan Folon, actually explained why he's such a communication expert, because he was not as a kid, and picked on, and how he was able to learn from that. And I heard that same type of evolution in your story, where you're saying, my friends, family, it just seemed organic for them, effortless. I put in extra steps, and this is how I did it on Reddit. Meanwhile, I really understood the audience by doing so. And I didn't tell anybody that. I used the dynamics to be able to deliver. And knowing firsthand, also saying in your statement that that's what you're doing with these softwares. That's what you're doing with your own voice, is you're putting in the time. The word research gets used in so many different ways, but you're getting the right findings. Yeah. And from there, as you're learning about the discussion, about all sides of the table, and what they're getting out of the discussion, you're then able to contribute and do so in an authentic way.
Yep. Yeah. You have to join the community before you can contribute to it, and certainly before you can draw from it.
It's like those social media marketers working on their first project and just promoting into conversations and getting removed from chat groups.
If I use the right hashtags, and certainly enough of them, then surely I'll make money.
Now, this is easier said than done. What
Absolutely. Yeah.
really allows you to understand the audience and be able to speak to them accordingly? Is it words that they are reacting to? I know for many different verticals that we work in, if I'm able to use some team members call it jargon, but if I'm able to use certain keywords, it shows, oh, he gets it. He's in these type of chats regularly. Is it that? Are there other factors that you look to listen for and implement?
Yeah, I mean, there is an element of jargon, but I don't like leaning on that too much because it's not just jargon, right? Like you can't just, shout, if you're a Redditor, you can't just walk down the street and say bananas for scale. And then people are like, why the fuck are you yelling that? It's more than jargon. It's context, right? Like the majority of it is context. So, you can say any words that you want, but if they're not in the right context, then people will see you as that outsider, right? And we all have those situations where someone that we know and who knows us deeply makes a joke that to someone who's like not in all those specific that point in that Venn diagram is like, okay, hold on, let me explain the context for an hour so that you understand just how funny this was. And so you kind of have to look at it through that lens of like, how do we demonstrate, not tell people, how do we demonstrate that we understand them? And a lot of that is like through comedy, right? So if you can make a joke, that summarizes the experiences of an audience without telling them, I understand your experiences, then they're going to feel understood. The challenge more often than not, especially in the larger companies that we work with, is communicating this to people in the higher, the leadership essentially. So oftentimes, when we're working with a, venture funded startup where the founder has, board control is usually kind of the best instance of this, or when they, it's a very small board and it's a very new company and the board is kind of just like trusting that the founder knows what they're doing. In those instances, it's really about keeping them focused on the core concept that was originally there and not having them try a bunch of different things in the same way that you would with paid advertising. With paid advertising, you're doing multivariate testing, right? So you're doing it very broadly. You're like, all right, we're going to try this. It's going to fail. We're going to try again. But with, any kind of community marketing, you're really doing your research, you're like the Facebook prank, as I mentioned, everybody sees that went viral, but nobody sees that I spent 30 days, 45 minutes every day. I was spending free writing to learn how to write and learn how to adapt my own voice. And 30 minutes a day I was spending on Reddit, just kind of like reading, like trying to comment, getting shot down because I said something super off color and then had to spend 3 hours researching to figure out what was off color about the thing that I just said. And there's no dictionary for it, right? So it's all that research work that kind of results in those big bursts. The larger companies, it's more about communicating to leadership, and what often happens, and you can know the name or you can know the story, but you can't know both. So I'll tell you the story. There's a Fortune probably 50 company that we worked with that. I'm sorry, I should correct myself. Someone who used to work for a Fortune 50 company who then left, seeing an opportunity, started an agency and came to us. And they were trying to go onto Reddit. And they were like, look, like when I was at this company, like I am a Redditor. I use Reddit. I define myself as a Redditor, and I was working with the team at Reddit, and like we get each other. And we'd come up with a concept that we knew was going to be super effective. And then I take it to my managers and be like, this is going to crush it. And they're like, I don't know if our brand would say stuff like that. And you had two people, right? You had the person managing the project and the person at the actual platform that both had cultural understanding. And then you had the leadership that didn't have cultural understanding, that was standing from the outside and just couldn't bring themselves to approve the project because they couldn't understand how this concept would resonate with the culture because they didn't know the culture. And you can't explain culture very succinctly. And so that was the challenge that she identified, which is that all these companies are really just struggling to understand and to scale that understanding throughout the team. So most often with cultural understanding, those are the things that are the most challenging. And, again, Facebook prank, like I'm wacky, I'm weird, I like playing with things. So when I communicated this story at like marketing conferences or bars. People would ask me like, what do you do for work? And I would say like, oh, I'm a marketer, but like, not like I do weird stuff, for example. And then I told that story 100 times. I got really good at telling that at different lengths with different, inflection points to different audiences. I could tell it to my mom in a minute. I could tell it to, a fellow technical marketer in 2 hours, and I could captivate the audience for both of those time periods. I just got really good at telling that story. And by the time I went to write that story, I knew how to tell that story. And the same thing goes for years later. We made Spiritual Bro, which it started as a joke of like, what if we make a Grammarly for our, a Grammarly, but instead of correcting your spelling, it corrects your spirit. So if you say like, I need a Tesla, it's like, you mean I am making space for a Tesla? And we kept telling this joke verbally, and then we're like, it's called Guru Clippy. People are like, what? And then like people from the 90s are like, you mean like the little clip, like the little, paper clip from like, yeah, okay. Like they were super captivated throughout the story. And then you get to the punchline, like, and then I had bought spiritualbro.com for a different reason. And then one day I was like, maybe I should switch out the punchline. And I switched out the punchline, and it got to that like 90% of people who heard the story, like, oh, that's so good. I'm like, okay, great. That's it. Then we made a sales page. And once we went, or I'm sorry, not even a sales page, we made a sales pitch. And one of our investors, it was an email to 20 people being like, we're going to do this thing. And one of our advisors responded to that email being like, I'll fund that. Okay. Wasn't a pitch deck, wasn't asking for funding, have a business model anywhere associated with it. And he just chipped in. And then we made it, and we made a website for it, and kind of surreptitiously now all we have to do is drive people to the website, and they're like, bah! And that's it, right? Like that's the joke. So it does exist. You can use it. And so it really is doing the research and understanding it, but then also communicating that understanding to the powers that be, right? If you're in a small startup, it could be the board, or, if our creative team is working with a small startup, it's really, again, communicating why we need to stay on point with the founder, because they're like, no, we need to do all these things. And it's like, okay, but you're not going to do anything effectively if you try and do all these things. So yeah, it's communication within the team, it's communication with partners, and then it's communication with the community.
I'm always on the edge of my seat during your stories, Brian, and gonna check out Spiritual Bro, Guru Clippy after this. I want to paint the picture a bit more for listeners. I know you work, we won't name anybody, with some of the largest social platforms. I know you work with organizations of all these different sizes, and you're able to have these discussions. And I mention that because it reflects a mass of individuals that are going through this content, these digital environments that you're building, and want to speak a bit about AI. And maybe that term's misused a little bit. Maybe automations is more appropriate, but it's something that I get asked about a lot, and I'm able to speak to it to an extent in terms of marketing. And some of the things that you've shown me from an AI standpoint, I mean, they surpass human abilities in terms of the tech that you're creating, what it's able to do on a daily basis, what it's able to create on its own, what it's then able to distribute to, I'll say again, mass volumes of a specific target audience. How are you using AI? Where is AI going? What are the capabilities that you see for your organization and just for the space to hold in the months and the years to come?
Yeah, great question. My perceptions and experience, my perception is largely colored by my experience. And back in 2018, I had started kind of nonlinear blogging. So like every story, like all the stories that I'm telling are kind of chunked out into the system called Mythos. And I kind of fell into that. And long story short, get a call from my dad, and he's like, how are you doing? I'm like, great. And he's like, well, I haven't talked to you in 2 weeks. And I was like, oh shit. Oh yeah. Sorry. And I just kind of fell into my project and writing, and I was enjoying it. And so ended up having a conversation with him. And then he's like, talk to your, call your mom. And I'm like, call my mom. And she's like, call your sister. So I call my sister and call my grandparent. Each conversation was probably about 40 minutes. And each conversation, as I finished the last of them, I realized that every single one of these conversations had the exact same structure, which was, how are you doing? me then excitedly talking about what I was writing and working on. Then being, well, no, are you doing anything for fun? And I'm like, well, I enjoy what I do, but yes, I'm also doing, gymnastics and yoga and da da da. And they're like, okay, well, but are you seeing anyone? And I'm like, 30 minutes into the conversation, I'm like, okay, my Jewish family wants to know if I'm dating. Got it. And so, I see, the pattern, right? So I all 2 week long, when I'd fallen into that, I was looking at patterns, and now I see this pattern. So I ended up creating what is now known as BrianBot, Brian.bot, which is an AI augmented version of myself. What I realized was that, BrianBot inherently, when he went online, didn't know anything. And so when someone would ask BrianBot a question, early on, it was a logic based, but now it's AI and fuzzy logic. And so people would ask a question, and if BrianBot knows the answer, thinks he knows the answer, then he responds. If he doesn't know the answer, he passes it through to the human. But unlike most kind of like website chatbots, instead of telling the person that's chatting with it, like, hey, the bot doesn't know what we're talking about, so let me get the human, right? Creating that separation between AI and human. It does the same thing that you do if you text me and I'm in the shower, which is that, like, you don't get a response. I'll respond to you when I am available. And so that kind of removal of separation between AI and human made things change in very subtle but very interesting ways, in which, this didn't become this process of saying, I don't want to talk to people, go away and talk to this other thing, but rather this process of augmentation. So there wasn't a separate self. And in the time since, a lot of the companies who ask me about AI and like they want to integrate it, they're constantly creating that separation. So they're saying like, okay, we'll get people to talk over here. Like, we don't have time to address these questions. Like, we can't, right? So it's all this distancing language that pushes their customers, their community, like people that they rely on, typically for money, elsewhere, and says like, don't bother us. And that attitude is typically what I see associated with AI, and it typically results in negative outcomes either immediately or downstream. So, I look at it very much as this process of augmentation. And for me, kind of tracking back to, again, my Facebook prank story, I told that story like 100 times, and it got to the point where I would show up to some event and I'd meet someone new, and then someone who I already knew would be like, oh, tell the story, tell the story, tell the story. And in my head, all I would hear is dance, monkey, dance. And I just got tired of doing it. But at the same time, I really enjoyed how people received it. But like, I'm telling this story, they're like super enthralled and laughing hysterically. And meanwhile, my mind's like, I should do laundry later. Like, my mouth is saying the things, but like, I'm emotionally not there. And it felt disingenuous. So when I wrote that story, it was because I wanted to encapsulate the genuineness of wanting to tell that story, but allow people to hear it beyond my desire to tell it. That's kind of how my, BrianBot became, right? It's like, if I can encapsulate this genuineness, like really effectively once, then when, people hit me up all the time, they're like, hey, like, what is Reddit? I've answered that question a million times. So for me to answer that question in a genuine way and not be like, fuck, I got a bunch of other stuff to do, and like, I just met you and, whatever, it's difficult. But when you have that AI layer, then the AI can give that genuine response that you created previously. And then if they ask a question that has never been asked before, then now you give a new genuine answer. You teach the AI to give that genuine answer next time. And perpetually, the only people that you're talking to are the people who've asked the questions that have never been asked before. And so that was kind of the experience that I cultivated for myself, but it was also something that I found was really effective. Throughout this, one of my oldest friends, and also the reason that I refused to date academics for a decade before accidentally going on a date with my wife, who's in science, he referred to his doctorate in cognitive and evolutionary anthropology from Oxford as a good fallback degree because of an AI system that he built, where what he does is he takes textual data, and some of the data that he most often uses these days is Reddit data. It's called culturepulse.ai. And basically what they do is they scrape all of the data that represents a subreddit or community. And so it's everyone who's communicating through text. And he uses natural language processing to look at how that communication is happening. What is the structure of that language? But rather than look at the behaviors of those people, he looks at the belief systems that drive those behaviors, right? So he looks at the root of that. most behavioral, like machine learning, you need a massive amount of behavioral data, and it needs to be updated constantly in order to be remotely accurate. And it only really has the ability to predict anything that has happened before, right? So it can't predict like a black swan event or an emerging trend. What he does is he takes all this data, and instead of looking at behavior, instead of looking at behavior, he looks at belief systems, and belief systems change much less frequently. And so with all of that, he creates these kind of low fidelity AI agents. So each individual that's communicated in this data set, he creates this AI agent that says, okay, this person has a, high degree of fairness, a low degree of this, and, they're has a libertarian moral signature or whatever. And then they take all of these agents and they put them into a simulation. They put them in a system together so that they can interact. So now what you have is, it's called a multi-agent system, multi-agent AI. And then they basically created an AI layer to have a conversation with that system, because the human can't really, you can only kind of jump from point to point, right? Like you can't tap into the consciousness of the planet, but you can get a bunch of points of data. So they had to make a system to communicate. And what's really interesting is that they're basically using quantitative data to validate qualitative intuition. And so this is part of the reason why this person formerly from the Fortune 50 company contacted us, is like, hey, I have this qualitative understanding. I can in an instant be like, yeah, they'll love that. Like I'm a Redditor, I know they'll love that. But when I try and communicate it to someone who doesn't have that qualitative understanding, it doesn't land. And so they basically needed quantitative data to validate qualitative understanding. And that's what the system does. So again, there's a difference between, in my mind, there's a difference between separating the human from the AI and just kind of pushing it away and saying like, it'll do the thing. It is the magic thing. It is, this other thing, versus saying that it's a tool that we can work with. So I very much am interested in and working on the types of things that are augmentative, not replacive, if that's a word.
Yeah. I like that collaboration between the quantitative data to be able to back up the qualitative findings, and allowing AI to do it and then have it roll out from there. We always say anything we put in a marketing strategy or any insights or recommendations we have are merely assumptions until they're proven with the data, with the quantitative findings. For us, it's media buying in many cases. It's a very straightforward use case of it, as you mentioned before. Variant testings of audiences, messaging funnels. We're able to identify the pockets of performance. The data tells us what to scale from there. Could even set up machine learning to do it beyond levels and across more segmentations than a human could potentially do. I was going to say my team, but don't want to sell them short. Any human for that matter. I remember looking at this for advertising AI and optimizing across over 11 million lines of data, where I could probably tell you 50 targeting filters offhand. And you were even talking about some of the psychographics there that are common in marketing. And that's really led to our whole philosophy on marketing: test, optimize, scale, setting up tests, optimizing them to the best levels of performance, optimizing towards what's working best, and looking to find avenues to scale. For anybody that's listening in, perhaps they're a founder, a marketer, a technologist, word I've been trying to use more, but what could they be testing out if they're hearing all this and saying, Brian gets it, how do I live like this? What can they be experimenting on their own? What can they be applying to their goals?
Yeah, I mean, I think and we had a partner who's not to be named, who tried to automate. He was a very logical person and tried to automate, but he kind of just did a very common mistake, was he stepped too far into automation. He got really excited. He learned a little bit, right? He learned a little bit of, kind of fun. It was specifically ClickUp, which I'm not a huge fan of, but ClickUp has some automations. And he figured out how to use those and then just got excited. And he got excited and he tried to automate too much. And so then, and this is a partner of ours, so we refer clients to them. And we referred someone to them, and the person responded with like, yeah, I got this like weird automated email that said that he like wasn't taking on clients and I had to fill out a form or something. And, this is a substantial individual that we had referred. And what had happened was that he just tried to automate too much, and he had a clumsy process. There was an error, which happens. So the thing that we, and it's not as sexy, but the thing that we say all the time is like do it progressively, right? Like figure out that one thing that you can automate and do it really well, and then test it, optimize and scale it, right? Like I love that frame. And, it's, for me, it was like, telling this Facebook prank story, like I was testing. I didn't know I was at the time, but I was. And then I was optimizing. So I was figuring out how to tell the story. And then when I wrote the article, I was scaling. And, same thing with Spiritual Bro. I kept telling this joke. I kind of got tired of telling it. So I wrote it. And then someone responded to that saying, I'll fund it. So that I made it. So that I scaled it even further. And now it's at a point where like I reference it and then people go to it and then they're like, oh, that's funny. And I'm like, great. Mission accomplished. So it's really just look for that thing that you can optimize and not, again, there's a difference between the thing that you're trying to avoid and the thing that you're trying to enhance. And so for me, I was trying, when I wrote my Facebook prank article, I was trying to enhance the experience that someone had of receiving that story. Because, when people are at a conference, they're like, oh, tell the story. And I just like didn't want to, because I told it so many times. I'd give the short version and it wasn't the best version. So for me, I was trying to enhance the experience of the people who were receiving it by putting it into a medium where I could give it, my best go this one time. Versus avoidance is like, what this partner of ours was doing is that he was like, I don't want to talk to these people. Like, I already know what I need from them. I already know that if I get that from them, that I can figure it out. But he, essentially unintentionally dismissed the concept of consent, because he was asking for a very intense piece of their financial data as a means to help them. But he was asking it of people who didn't yet know him and didn't yet trust him. And so he bypassed that step, and that made them uncomfortable. And so you really have to approach it from, again, an enhancement standpoint. So what is to answer your question, like, what is the thing that you can do that will, by virtue of packaging it, by virtue of automating it, by virtue of kind of like creating this experience, can you enhance someone's experience of a conversation that you might otherwise have with them? Not something that you're like, oh, I'm so tired of dealing with these types of customers or these types of conversations, right? That's that avoidance. What can you enhance? What can you make better? And I would say to look for those things and to test it. What's a way that you can delight people? Like look for that. And oftentimes, if you look through that lens, you will find the things that recover more time and help you convert more customers.
Coming from that place of how can I enhance? How can I delight? I like that. We use project management software, various types of communication channels with clients, with prospective clients. We have different automations in play. And at times I do see that avoidance or barrier in some of the actions we're trying to put out there. And I take it a step back and say, are we doing this so we have less work? Or are we doing this because it's of more value to the other side? But I like these words: enhance, delight. They capture an emotion. Recently had a content marketing funnel email expert on the podcast, and they were saying a good headline arises emotion, and all the different types of emotion that can stimulate action behind it is something I've researched for years, and research not just by reading articles, which I do, but physically testing out. I've always been fascinated on why people do the things that they do. And that's why really enjoy your insights and how you're applying those type of social elements into scripts, the work that you guys are doing. What if it is, playing off the example you provided, and an individual finds, hey, I'm automating too much, not getting the responses I want. I'm not making the other side feel delightful. Or what if it's just not as effective? Maybe that's the reason why the numbers aren't showing up. How do you go about optimization? I imagine not everything you did worked right out of the gate, because that's not how the best projects are created. Obviously, I'll go back to the Post-its. You have a lot of ideas written on each one of those. It shows a lot of efforts behind what you do. It's a journey to get there. So, I always like painting that picture for the audience and stating, hey, it's not a matter of coming up with an idea and execution just works. There's usually steps towards it. How do you optimize when you're going through these stages of development?
You hit the nail on the head a bit ago by saying that you were fascinated. So I think, and it was in a pitch deck, and it was a really cogent line, which I'm going to butcher now, but this process requires people to be anthropologists, and most people aren't. And so, it's talking about avoidance. When you're pushing this thing away and you're like, it's uncomfortable to me and I don't want to deal with it. As our therapist said, avoidance is expensive. And so the more that you push it away, the more challenges that it's going to create. So when you're trying to optimize, go at it with this exploration, kind of treat it like anthropology, like, oh, that's so interesting. Like, I wonder why. And when you do that incorrectly, as our partner did by kind of over automating and just honestly incorrectly programming an automation flow, it was like a trigger for if someone sent me an email with this keyword, then it would send a response. It was just a bad trigger. Apologize and do so quickly and earnestly, and then repeat. Right? Be more interested. Oh, I didn't know to look there. So I think it's really that process. But the challenge is for smaller companies, right? So, venture funded startups, I would say up to Series B, they're pressured either intrinsically or actually pressured by their board to drive results. So, when you're kind of in this fight or flight state where like, I have to do this thing, it's really difficult to be curious. It's really difficult to be playful. And so that is more often than not the challenge with newer companies. And then with larger companies, 1,000 people plus, it's just like process, right? Like getting everybody on board and getting buy-in. And it's two different processes, but the same challenge, which is really just like making space to ask questions, and ask questions that are not self-serving, right? Like, how do I not have this frustration or pain anymore? But rather to be curious. And then when you fuck up, acknowledge it, and apologize and be like, oh, thank you so much for telling me. And one of my favorite things to do, it's like my highest nerd cred that I value the most, is when people on Reddit apologize to me. When I'll I'll make like an ad with like the comments open and people start to troll me, and then I'll respond with something that's like kind of like a cheeky pushback. And again, I'm like cheeky, I'm pushing back, I'm playing with them. And they're like, oh shit, I didn't realize you were a real person. I'm sorry. Like I was just trying to be snarky. It's like, all right, it was snarky. It was clever. It's all right. And it's funny because like people expect that no one's going to see. It's like someone always sees that. You see that like people who are doing the moderation for Facebook are having like mental health crises, and it's just a high burnout business because like it's not directed at them, but they have to see it, they have to experience it, they like emotionally kind of take it on a little bit, some more than others. And so when you acknowledge that in business, for me, like one of the first things that I automated was we were doing like interactions on Reddit for a client. And they kept asking us like, oh, how's it going? And then I'd have to like stop what I'm doing and give them an update. So I made a system. So every time we would do something, they got an update. Every time we'd update a doc with a note of like, this is a thing that we're learning, or like, this is a new post that we did, it would update a doc. And they basically just stopped talking to us. They were just like, okay, you're crushing it, keep going. And like, it literally took like 90% of client communication off my plate. And then one day they all just started to get really needy. I'm like, what is going on right now? And it took me about a week, but I figured out that the API that we were using to essentially update their Slack every time we did anything broke. So all of a sudden they just stopped getting updates. So they just stopped. They thought we stopped working. And then I figured that out. I'm so sorry. I just realized this. Let me fix it. And I did. And they're like, okay. And it went back to normal. But, there have been times before where I'm like just trying to get the work done and I forget to communicate to the client what's happening. And there are other times when the client's, very noisy and asking what's happening, and then I don't get to get the work done. So by automating the process of updating someone and making them feel comfortable, I then create the space to do the work that is needed and not kind of, have to update one by one by one. This is what's happening. So yeah, I mean, again, avoiding avoidance, being curious, kind of all these platitudes that are easy to say, but then, when your board's breathing down your neck or you need to figure out how to, generate revenue, it's hard to do, but that's the work.
Hard to keep that all into account when the deadlines are pushing up, numbers aren't quite there for traffic or whatever it may be, but these are great. Avoidance is expensive. The curiosity aspects, we've run into issues where API broke and had to change different things up. But I like how you're applying these. Like you said, you're creating a better customer experience by having these automations in play, looking at what they're really getting out of the discussion and adding that, but on a more frequent basis. What about scale? Are there any examples you're able to talk about for scale? Any insights, tips that could leave listeners with, or just in general? That's what everyone's looking for, right? How is scale achievable?
Yeah. I mean, it's achievable in a lot of ways. And we talked about this the last time we met up. We have a new partner called Clay, inc.one/Clay, inc.one/Clay. I say that now because I'm about to rave about this. So Clay is a system that allows you to do three things in sequence. You can scrape data, you can enrich data, and you can act on data. So for example, we can say, all right, anyone who is a marketer with experience in Airtable or Zapier, give us a list. Then we can add in integrations to basically enrich that data, use something like People Data Labs to find their email addresses, use something like Debounce to verify that those email addresses are sendable, so on and so forth. We also have another partner called Banner Bear, so inc.one/Banner Bear. And Banner Bear basically allows us to create images using data. So for example, if I'm running a conference and we have 20 speakers and we want every speaker to have a vertical and a square image to share on social of their photo, their name, the time that they're speaking, the location that they're speaking, so that they can promote themselves and thus promote the event. If we have 20 people, let's say that's like 2 hours of design time per person. And that's if we get the right headshot and we get the right time, we don't have to move the schedule and then have to redo everything. So what Banner Bear allows you to do is create a template to create an image from data. So I can just have an Airtable with like all of my speakers, all the times that they're speaking. And I just click a button, it passes it, passes the data over to Zapier and then to Airtable and then makes my image. And then even from there, I can say, send this person an email saying, here's the images. So I say that to say this is that we're currently running a campaign to promote Banner Bear to people that understand what I just said. Now, if you know Airtable or Zapier or both, then it is likely that you understand what I just said and are excited by it. If you manage a team of designers or you manage an agency and you know Airtable and Zapier more so. So we basically carved out that target audience. And instead of saying, hello, so-and-so, we'd like to tell you about this new thing, we wanted to demonstrate it, but then also demonstrate that we understand their plight, right? Like we understand how difficult it is to have to, manage a team and spend 20 hours to do this thing, right? So this is all the context for a scale example. So what we're doing right now is we're scraping data regarding this audience with Clay, pulling it in. Some of that data includes their profile photo on LinkedIn, and then also their name. Then we're passing that data off to Banner Bear, and we are creating an image, which is basically a conference badge for them for a conference that they didn't register for. And so it's their photo and their name, their company logo. And then we're sending them essentially like a 2-sentence email saying, hey, we saw that you have an agency. We have a few different versions of this, but we saw that you have an agency, and are running events. Would you be interested in something that could programmatically generate images using data from Airtable or Zapier? For example, the image below, which was created automatically and not by a designer. Here's a 3-minute video of how we did it, and then showing them the video. So we're kind of again, breaking that fourth wall and communicating, we understand your life, we understand your experience, we understand your struggles, not by communicating, hey, and we've all gotten these emails like, are you looking for a way to do that thing? And it's very kind of like speaking directly at the thing. That's like showing up for a date and being like, I go to the gym 5 days a week. It's like, okay, I don't believe you, show me. instead of doing that, showing up and just demonstrating that. And that's going to depend on your audience. It's going to depend on what you're demonstrating. But, for us, the joke was like, not the joke, but I think the thing that was the most meaningful to Clay is like when you scrape data and then you watch it enrich in real time and you watch the data just like populate in the table. Like when we were doing videos early on to kind of explain what this was to people, they would see that bit. Oh, and like, okay, cool. That's the moment. And with Banner Bear, like we had people on our team who, previously had to do design, and they're contractors for us, and, community contractors, marketing contractors. And we'd say, hey, like, we need you to do this work. And then they would click a checkbox in an Airtable field and watch it, auto generate. Or we'd like show a partner to be like, hey, look what we made. And then be like, oh, and we're like, cool, that's the point. So that's essentially what we're showing them. We're showing them that moment. Now there's a whole bunch of other stuff that has to happen. You have to set up this app and put in the data and but that moment when it's just like you press the button and the machine puts out, that's the thing that really gets people excited. So if we can capture that moment, even if that's not like the actual thing that happened, but that's just the moment of serendipity, magic, like the output of all the work. If we can capture that and convey it in 2 sentences in a GIF, even better, then done. We've now, in a few times when we've done this, we've created campaigns. And part of the reason why we were playing with Banner Bear in this way was one of the most effective, probably the second most effective campaign we have ever done to date, was the metaverse platform that we were marketing. And we took a picture of the little avatars in the world with a billboard next to a billboard. And then we cut out the billboard. So we had just basically a PNG with a transparent, it was an open space, just kind of like a super fancy photo frame. And then we used Clearbit to grab people's logos and put the logo inside that billboard. And then we emailed them and said, hey, we made a metaverse for you. Would you like it? And then it was the domain to the metaverse / their brand name. And they're like, huh? Right. They're seeing their logo like in this virtual world. They're seeing a URL that's customized to them, and they clicked and they were interested. So it's figuring out how to do that. That was part because the metaverse allowed us to like create any new world based on whatever followed the / right. So you're using the tools that are available to you. But again, just showcasing that moment of like serendipity, whatever you call it, astonishment, delight. Yeah.
I look for that moment where the audience's eyes
Mm-hmm.
open up a little bit more. And I tell this to founders a lot of times for investor marketing. If they're sitting down with a prospective investor, that actual second, what was said, how can we recreate that in messaging? That's what I'm hearing. And in a more personalized fashion, which is the goal of variants and funnels. If you're able to have the audience feel like you're talking to them, meanwhile have the scale and have thousands, millions of people going through these journeys you're building out, these digital funnels, it's powerful. So being able to have that focused, and in each stage, want to tell the audience, Brian just gave you a lot of secrets there, by the way. I didn't know if you were going to mention each of these, and hearing you talk about Clay, hearing you talk about Banner Bear, how those are used, how you're implementing, a lot to work off there. I would rewind that section and play with that outline a little bit. And Brian, feel like I could talk with you for hours here as we begin to wrap the show, just for sake of your time, listeners, getting the whole episode rounded up. Is there anything we didn't get to? Are there any final notes, anything you want to emphasize and leave listeners with?
No, I mean, I think you touched on a lot of things very broadly that all kind of come to the same point, which is, really just being curious and trying to understand, taking that anthropological approach to your community or communities that you want to speak to, or the community that you wish to have. And that's really the external process where you're communicating externally by being curious. But when you're communicating internally, either to yourself or your team, just making sure that you make the space for yourself so that you have the ability to communicate with others. If you're communicating to yourself, that could be therapy, meditation, yoga, right? Like founders who have mental health practices are ones who make smarter decisions. And then also, communicating to your team. Like if you micromanage your team and you push them and you're constantly kind of like, triggering their stress, right? So if you're the type of, I can't say leader, if you're the type of CEO that demands and commands, then you're making a team that's kind of always in those stress hormones and kind of swarming in them. And then you get worse work. So what we've learned over the years in that regard is really like the more that we can make space for the individual that we're working with, the better work that we get. And sometimes the better price that they quote us. People enjoy working for us. They get education. They feel, like one of the questions I love asking is like, what are you looking to do, in the future? Like what do you want to accomplish? And we had someone that we hired to manage our community who just wanted to restart his D&D campaign. And I didn't really see how the work that we were doing together helped him to do that. And so we ended up parting ways so that he could find work that was more resonant. Versus, we have other people who come on to us, as copywriters and become marketers. They're like, well, like I've always worked with marketers and I've always wanted to do this other thing. Okay, cool. Like, well, here's some resources that you can use. And then you hand them stuff that takes me no time. I just give them access to something or point them in a direction. And then they dive really deep and they get really interested. And then they ask me a super specific question. So they did the work, then I'll do work, right? So it's this parable of if you step, I step. So, from an internal perspective, like making sure that you make space for yourself to be calm, and not trigger other people's anxieties. When you're talking to your team, making space for the whole of the individual, not just the person that, the aspect that's doing work for you. And when you're communicating with your community or the community that you desire, really like, again, making space to understand them and communicate to them as them. It's kind of a joke, but at the same time, not a joke. Is at One Ink Cooperative, we call ourselves a space making company that specializes in communications technology. It's space making. When you make space, energy floods into it. If you try and, making energy as a physicist that we met one time, he said, yeah, making energy is easy. Making space is hard.
Making energy is easy. Making space is hard. Tony Robbins says where focus goes, energy flows. It sounds like space is taking it to the whole next level. And want to point out, you study this not just from an academic standpoint, but from your own experiments. And this is what you're really shouting to founders and how they speak to their team, their community, to everybody involved. So I want to highlight that. That's what's behind all of it. And Brian, you leave me with so many questions. I want to, keep finding out more. If any listeners want to get in touch with you, get in touch with, your organization, what is the best way for them to do so?
You can find us at ink.one, inc.one. My email is Brian with an I at ink.one. And then everything can be found through there. We have our community with all the tools that we mentioned, some case studies on those tools, events, marketplace of services, book club, list of some of our partners and their backstories. So we have a big rabbit hole to fall into. Where you choose to go is kind of the fun part, right? We get to see like, oh, okay, you went there. My favorite thing is to get really specific emails like, hey, I just spent 3 hours reading. And I always like to see where people pop up.
Sure. Well, you heard it. Go there, choose your own adventure. It is going to be a good, engaging path. Brian, want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on. Really enjoyed the discussion. Want to thank everybody for tuning in here as well, too. And we'll see everyone next time.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, if you, one of the last bits I'll leave with this is if you want to be interesting, then be interested. And you definitely were very interested. Yeah, great questions. I'm excited to hear reflections from audience.
Thanks. I appreciate that. It was genuine, and that's what makes this all fun, and encourage founders to take that advice there. If you want to be interesting, be interested. Most important part of communication there. So yeah, thanks again, Brian. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.